Hello and welcome to the Gaggle Bubble Challenge. And if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Samuely. With me today, of course, is co-founder of the Gaggle, Peter Lavelle. So, Peter, one event that hasn't aroused a great deal of attention that this year happens to be the 50th anniversary of the Helsinki Final Act of 1975. And to the extent that it has aroused any commentary, it's nearly always of the tone that somehow this was really great for the West, and that the West somehow came out triumphant from Helsinki, and that the Soviet Union came out really badly.
It's the opposite. It's the
It's
opposite.
exactly the opposite, and that's always they would always put this way that, well, of course, what happened at Helsinki is that war was outlawed, and that's something being violated by the Soviet Union. The unilateral change of borders was outlawed, and that's violated by Russia. But somehow they created this so-called basket three of human rights,
Good three.
and the West was able to use human rights
A cudgel,
against
a cudgel against the
a
Soviet
cudgel,
Union.
exactly, a cudgel against the Soviet Union. Just like every single aspect of the story is false. And what is interesting is that Russia paid a great deal of attention and still continues to pay a great deal of attention to Helsinki. And it's clear that what the violations of Helsinki were undertaken by the West and were not undertaken really quite early on. And of course, the human rights thing, and we want to come to that because I want to show what the Helsinki Final Act actually said about human rights. That was completely abused and misused by the West. Because it doesn't say what people think it says with the human rights. Not to mention the fact that the West always has a very one-sided view of human rights. They've always interpreted the human rights, even though when you look through all of the human rights documents, um, there's obviously as much there about that sort of freedom from coercion by the state that there also is freedom from economic scarcity, freedom from unemployment, freedom from having no health care, freedom from all
Yes,
those other
very
things.
much they wrote FDR's for freedoms.
Exactly, and the thing, yes, there's the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but there's also the sort of the International Convention on Social, Economic, and Cultural Rights. These, the whole body of human rights.
And what was one word that's not used there?
Yeah, that,
Democracy. Democracy.
exactly. So here's I want to just show you first of all a typical argument or typical article
Well,
in.
before
Yep.
we get there,
Sure.
what did the Soviet Union want to get out of this process?
Mhm.
Which is not, I mean, people that are serious people know that the Soviet Union, it was a great triumph of the Soviet Union because it was a recognition of post-war Europe,
Right.
Europe's borders. This was something very, very important to the Soviet Union because they wanted the recognition of the sacrifice that the Red Army made defeating Nazism.
Right.
And so this was something that Brezhnev was very, very proud of, okay?
Yes.
Because they finally grudgingly got the recognition from the West of the geopolitical realities of the Second World War. Now, that doesn't seem really important to maybe an American or a Brit or anything like that. That's very important that
Right.
was very, very important to the Soviet Union.
Yes.
It was and it recognized and legitimized.
Right.
Okay,
Right.
so all of it was Roosevelt sold out Poland and
Right.
Yalta and all that. No, all that was put in the past. No,
Right.
now this is where in 1975, we have both sides recognize and legitimize the
Right.
geopolitical realities of the moment. Now,
Right.
it's not spun that way in the West. That
No.
was very important to the Soviet
That's
Union.
exactly because, of course. and this is the point that is invariably not recognized, and to this day in the West, that is that the Soviet Union and today Russia has very great security concerns. Security concerns. You know, they'd gone through two world wars really within it was really what 40 within 40 years they'd fought two horrific world wars, and therefore it was very very important for them to essentially put down on paper that essentially, you know, there can't be any more violations of, of the Soviet Union, of Soviet interests, and then of Russian interests in the way that there had been in the two world wars, which were fundamentally the West versus the East. I mean, there was both of them were the West. I mean, in both cases, there were other aspects to it, but fundamentally, that was where it was fought out, the West versus East. And so, therefore, they were very worried almost immediately from the start of the Cold War that the West had designs on provoking another war with the Soviet Union. And
And you can actually kind of bookend it. You go from Churchill's percentages
Mhm.
proposal to the final act. That's the bookend. So the Soviets didn't have to worry about the West saying, "Well, let's divvy it up here. You know, we'll give you this." You know, it wasn't Stalin that wrote that on the back
Right,
of an
right,
envelope. It was Churchill that wrote it on the back of an envelope.
that's
Okay.
that's right.
And the Soviets wanted recognition. No, we don't want any more of that. We want a legal, internationally recognized political settlement.
Right. That's right. That's right. And so therefore, it's essentially the West had to give up their more aggressive designs. And let's not forget, there were moves in the 1950s and in 1940s for this sort of what they called liberation and rollback, particularly from on the American side. Somehow, what we're going to liberate Eastern Europe. This was something that was very worrying for the United States because I thought this basically, I mean, for the Soviet Union, that hey, you are trying to provoke a war here with us. I mean, that you're planning essentially to interfere in Eastern Europe in order to provoke a war against us. And there's no question they were doing that in Hungary. I mean, it failed. They failed, but that was they were the Russians were very well aware of what the Americans were doing in Hungary.
Look at Radio Free Europe, what they were
Exactly,
doing.
Radio Free, and there were others, not just Radio Free. There were other sort of broadcasts that was funded by the U.S. government, whipping up this fervor against the communists. And of course, they knew exactly what it was. So when Imre Nagy announced that he was leaving the Warsaw Pact, the Soviet Union could not but see this as a direct threat to them. You know, that this was a plan of using Hungary and then other states to direct NATO, which had been created years earlier, to direct NATO against them. And that's why they wanted that on paper, that you're not going to do this anymore, that you're going to recognize
Yes,
the realities. You won't
that's
do this again.
it's kind of the origins of NATO expansion in a way, because West Germany had become a member of NATO, which was for the Soviet Union was almost incomprehensible. Okay, and so when Nagy said they're going to pull out of the Warsaw Pact, they think this is it. Now. Hungary was an Axis power,
Right,
George.
right,
Okay. And
exactly.
so is this going to be the expansion of NATO? This sounds comical to maybe to today. It wasn't comical to
That was
them.
absolutely
Okay.
not at all comical, and that's why it was so important to them, and that's why they still remember it to this day because they said, "Hey, this was a moment in which the West recognized our security concerns," and this was a part and parcel of the détente that was pursued by Nixon and by Kissinger, that you have to acknowledge their security concerns. And that haven't really, no one had really talked very much about that. So yeah, they do have security. You may not like them, you may not like the communists and whatever, but you have to recognize that they have legitimate security concerns. You can't just do whatever you feel like doing and not expect a reaction. And so that's why to this day, the Russians, elevate this as one of the great conferences, great documents of the post 1945 world.
Okay, we had a bit of an unstable line there for a second. I don't know if it was me or George that froze up, but George finished the sentence. Well, he finished the sentence that made sense from the beginning, so I think we're okay.
Right. Yeah.
And another thing before I forget it, because I have this tendency of thinking too fast. My mouth isn't fast enough to catch up. Um, I want to discuss with George also before we finish this here is that this great attempt to bring stability to the European continent. Now, this is 1975, okay? This is 30 years after the war. Now, a lot has happened in between time, and then we're building upon the process.
Right.
What I want to talk before we finish this here, because I know George wants to go to the third basket with human rights, but it's a real pity that this process, the Helsinki process, could not survive the Cold War. And we need to
Right.
talk about why.
That's
Go
right.
ahead.
That's right. So here's a typical example of a kind of a Western response. This is from the Guardian, is what you would expect. And here it says the Helsinki Accord was a masterpiece of European diplomacy. 50 years on, we need its spirit more than ever. Now, whenever you read this title, you have an idea that the content is not going to be in any way in conformity with this. The OSCE hasn't stopped Putin's aggression. So the OSCE was set up
Right.
in the aftermath of Helsinki, and but it has the potential to help broker a peace in Ukraine when the time is right.
And when you see titles like this here, Spirit,
Hmm.
uh, we know who has good spirits and who has bad spirits,
Yes,
okay? I
that's right.
mean, they reveal themselves like that.
Exactly, exactly. So it was always, well, we were the good guys,
Yes.
they were the bad guys, and we did them a favor. We kind of signed an agreement with them, but the bad guys, they were of course immediately started violating the agreement. So here you say Vladimir Putin will probably never give up on his attempts to bring Ukraine into Russia, which is where it belongs. To his
Bring Ukraine into Russia. Wow, this thing hits it out of the park in the first sentence.
Exactly, first sentence. Exactly. That's right. Warped view of history. So that's yeah, that's point. It is a warped view of history. Those who oppose him tend to fall out of windows or suffer other accidents or go to prison. So that's it. So you've now framed the issue. You're now talking about Helsinki, this important agreement, and then those who oppose him tend to fall out of windows.
Accidents never happen in the West,
No,
George.
no, no, never, never. So I always love it when anytime anybody dies in Russia, they say, oh, well, Putin. But
Yeah.
whenever anyone dies in the West, no one ever, if you say, well, that's very strange, this death. Conspiracy theory.
Well,
Conspiracy
George and
theory.
I are not propagating any conspiracy theories, but there are a lot of people believe that it's not healthy to be around the Clinton clan. But I'll just let, our viewers
I think
decide.
that's an excellent point that about the Clinton clan. Exactly. Remarkable.
We're not saying
Number of,
anything.
not
We're
saying
not
anything.
making any claims
No,
here.
that's right. And then you find all these people. You remember the guy who wrote that book, Gary Webb, about the CIA and the Contras and the import of crack cocaine into the United States. Who was peddling conspiracies. Turned out everything he said was correct, and then he commits suicide. Amazing. He just commits suicide. Well, that the guy. You remember
And Keith Rich, was it
Seth Rich?
Seth Rich?
Yep.
Yeah, he was apparently, George, did you know that he was a victim of a robbery
Yeah, exactly.
but he still had his wallet.
That's right,
Yeah.
exactly. Amazing. A robbery, but a phone. I think he kept his phone, and they didn't take his phone.
Yeah.
Amazing. Well, you remember the guy? I always forget his name. Who wrote that book about George W. Bush? That he had been convicted of cocaine possession, and that his father had managed to get the record expunged. He also committed suicide. Amazing number of people just who just commit suicide or are involved in car accidents. But the point is, as you say, we don't know what the truth is. But everyone always seems to know the truth about whatever happened in Russia. Anyway, so if he agrees to a ceasefire, it will be only to gain time to replenish his forces before trying again. I thought
What does this have to do with the Helsinki
what's
process?
it sounds like you're kind of twisting it around a bit. If he agrees that he's the one who's not saying he wants to agree to a ceasefire, so why are you bringing it on him? Oh, he would agree to a ceasefire in order to buy time. That's kind of what he's saying that the West is trying to do, which is why he's not agreeing to a
Yeah.
ceasefire. All that would stop him then would be armed peacekeepers of some kind, as is already being discussed. If someone replaces him from his inner circle, there is unlikely to be change. So, as you said, what has any of that got to do with the Helsinki Final Act?
Well, it's interesting too, is that if someone replaces him from his inner circle, there is unlikely to be a change. So what does that say? Is that Russians are inherently aggressive people?
Yes,
Um, it's the system, the form of governance now over the last quarter century is ideologically rigid and cannot change. I mean, it's a very odd sentence,
right,
okay? It's
right.
it's not scholarly for
No,
sure,
no,
okay? I
yeah,
mean, what it is just intense bias and prejudice, okay?
exactly. That's right. Yeah,
Or, or, which this is not the argument this author is trying to make, or authors, is that there are inherent security demands that any Russian state would make. But that's not what they want you to think.
you're absolutely
Okay.
right. That's it. You're absolutely right. Also, to be honest, I mean, the history of Russia is that usually there's quite a lot of change following the replacement of a leader. A lot of change after Stalin's death. A lot of change after the death of Brezhnev. So, by no means is it the case. Oh, there's no
Yeah,
change.
and was that a good change? But
No,
we'll leave that.
exactly. There you
We'll
go.
leave that hanging. We'll leave that hanging.
Exactly, exactly. And as we discussed with Sheila Fitzpatrick the other day, the case of the following the death of Stalin this was by no means were they all positive changes as everyone has presented it in the West, and even within the Soviet Union themselves, they didn't like some of the changes that took place following the death of Stalin, such as the release of prisoners. Suddenly there was a crime wave. Within a few months of the death of Stalin, they just started releasing the people in the Gulag, and these were hardened criminals who were suddenly inflicted on the
Oh,
people.
no, George, they were all political, right?
Exactly, they're all political. They're
Exactly,
all
exactly.
dissidents. Exactly right. Anyway, however, somewhere well hidden in Moscow, there must be people um, yearning for real peace, which would include recognizing Ukraine as a sovereign country, just as during the Cold War, there were people fairly well hidden in the communist establishment who yearned for democracy. They got their chance when Mikhail Gorbachev became leader in 1985. Sadly, the chance was
Is, is,
bungled.
is this a novel?
um, um,
People fairly well hidden.
But
Okay.
this goes back to what you said, because whatever else you can say about Gorbachev, Gorbachev still had an understanding that we have our security concerns. Now, he, of
And
course,
that's why he's hated because that's what he bungled
yes,
everybody.
yeah, exactly. Exactly. He bungled that. That was, there was things that were fundamental, and he completely made a hash of that.
And I would submit, and I think George would agree with me. I think Sheila Fitzpatrick would agree with me. And we should be careful on this because we want her to come back. But because of the ways Gorbachev bungled Soviet security requirements, we got Vladimir Putin. I'll leave that hanging in the
That's
air
right.
too.
That's right. Exactly. While waiting with slender hopes for the appearance of these benign forces, it is worth reminding what are these benign forces? I
Oh
mean,
yeah, and I'm sorry, John. Just stop there. I mean, and who's funding them?
yes, exactly. It is worth reminding everyone. I mean, so a benign force is one that accepts NATO forces on Russia's borders. Well, that's a benign
Oh no,
force.
George. No, benign forces agrees to the breakup of what would become the Russian Federation.
Exactly. That's yes. That's even more benign. The really good guys.
The ultra benign.
The ultra, yeah. These are the really good people. While waiting with slender hopes for the appearance of these benign forces, it is worth reminding everyone that there is an organization in place with many of the skills and machinery for promoting democracy and peace in Europe, and that is the OSCE, which is about to celebrate the 50th anniversary of its founding document, generally known as the Helsinki Final Act. So,
The Helsinki process was not about democracy.
no, it was not. It
Okay.
absolutely was not.
This is a fraud on the reader
Yes,
right here.
exactly. You're absolutely right. That was not what it was about. It was precisely about security. That was the key. The key. And to the contrary, it said no aggressive policies towards one another, no interference in the internal affairs of one another's states.
Correct me if I'm wrong, George, but this is where we get the phrase the indivisibility of security.
Exactly, exactly. We're going to come to that. We're going to take a
Okay.
look at that, exactly what it says. And then the adoption of the Helsinki Final Act was the dramatic and unexpected product of nearly 3 years of intense negotiation. Again, it's never presented that this was the Soviet Union that pushed for this. This was they were the ones who are the most interested in this. And as Lavrov pointed out recently, that, well, we were doing this since the 1950s. We first presented this in 1954, soon after the death of Stalin, kind of creating a pan-European security architecture. 54, what does that tell you? That's before the formation of the Warsaw Pact. In other words, they actually didn't want to set up the Warsaw Pact. They said, can we just dissolve NATO and create a pan-European security structure? The West, of course, showed no interest. And then the Russians created the Warsaw Pact. And then Moscow and its allies wanted to put a seal on the post-war order in Europe, including the division of Germany and the Soviet rule over the unhappy people of Central and Eastern Europe. That's a Soviet rule. And during those 3 years, however, it was turned around mainly by the 9 members of the European community, in which Britain played an important role, to become instead an exciting agenda for change. Oh, what is this exciting agenda? And we know where this is going. This is where the Final Act allowed frontiers to be changed by peaceful means, thereby keeping open the road to German and Irish unification. We'll see about this peaceful means, because that's what happened. Immediate aftermath of Cold War was precisely the opposite. It was not by peaceful means, and these were unilateral changes to borders. It committed signatories to increase military transparency through a catalog of confidence-building measures, and it defined an ambitious set of activities to facilitate trade, cultural contacts, and freer movement of people and information of all kinds. Is this happening now? I mean, are they allowing, Russians to move around freely in Europe? Are there cultural exchanges either happening
Yeah, I
through
mean, well,
sporting
George,
exchanges?
we could have a culture cancellation podcast. It
Right,
happens so often in Europe now.
right.
Tchaikovsky. Wow, that's seditious.
Yes,
I mean,
exactly.
seditious.
Gergiev, who gets fired, one of the extremely prestigious conductors gets fired because he's not, they don't like his politics. I mean, hey, that's not in the spirit of Helsinki. Um, and that's all thoroughly approved of. The Guardian wouldn't shed a tear over the cancellation of Gergiev. And then here's most significantly of all, as it turned out, it pledged signatories to respect human rights and fundamental freedom, including the freedom of thought, conscience, religion, or belief, stipulating that this was an essential basis for peace in Europe. This is all made up. They're saying that this was an essential basis because, much of the document wasn't about that. But this is what the West wants to do, because this is how the West exploited Helsinki for its own ends. And, oh, the dissidents. In the following years, the authoritarian governments that signed the Final Act made only small, grudging moves toward implementing those pledges. But there's also, did the West, do anything about human rights in the West? I mean, I know you're very exercised about human rights behind the Iron Curtain, but how exercised are you about human rights in the West side of the Iron Curtain? In the following years, let's implement those, but they were eagerly taken up by dissidents who collected thick dossiers of abuse of human rights to present to liberal governments and pressure groups, which then forced the Soviet Union to accept human rights as a subject for negotiation. Um, in other words, a factor in mutual security was how governments treat their people. This was an important innovation in international diplomacy. Gradually, this intense activity around human rights in the Soviet Empire helped to punch holes in the Iron Curtain. None of this, there's no historical basis for this. They always say this, that, oh, yeah, it was because of human rights with these punch holes. What's the basis? What's the basis of that claim? Much of those things like the Charter 77 came and went. I mean, it's like
Yeah, and weaken the regimes and lay some of the groundwork for a peaceful ending of the Cold War. Well, there's no evidence of that either. I
none,
mean,
no,
that's just pablum right there.
exactly.
It didn't weaken any regime, quote unquote.
I don't
Okay.
think so. Yeah.
Obviously, during the Cold War, only one side of the ledger had regimes. The other side of the ledger had governments.
Legitimate governments. Um, and so punch holes weaken their regime.
Look, everyone, I saw with my own eyes. I was a witness to the solidarity movement in Poland. That didn't end Soviet rule. Okay,
Yeah.
it had nothing to do with it,
No,
actually.
no, that's right. Um, and this became known as the Helsinki effect. The legitimacy of the Final Act derived from the fact that it was not a stitch up between great powers, but the result of 35 states negotiating doggedly until they reached consensus. Will there be another Helsinki effect? But you see, notice everything with this whole pablum that I've been reading out. None of that is at all what Helsinki was about and what the Russians see Helsinki as being about. The Russians are huge enthusiasts, but they don't see that's not what Helsinki was on. You've been going, the West has been going on and on about human rights ever since the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That wasn't what was singular about Helsinki. But they want to focus on that. Hey, because we used this against the Soviets, so hey, that was great. That was a neat idea
But
that
it
we could
had
just
no impact.
no.
It was a feel-good
Yeah,
effect for the
that's
West,
right.
but it had no impact at all.
Exactly.
And the Soviets and later the Russians cherished the Helsinki
Yeah,
process.
that's right.
Okay.
That's right. And so, will there be another Helsinki effect? Not in that form, and certainly not immediately, as repression in Putin's Russia is harsher than that of the ailing Soviet Union in its dying
You
days.
can't even make that comparison.
You can't even make this comment, but it was a dying days. 1975, it wasn't dying in 1975. That was kind of, it was almost like
No, because
the
that's
heyday of the
you
Soviet
had
Union.
the Helsinki process because there was the perception that the Soviet Union was quite strong. Okay.
Exactly.
Just the opposite.
That's the point. That was strong. Exactly. The Russian president has also severely weakened the OSCE by violating most of its pledges, including its foundational commitments to international peace and the non-violent
Oh,
settlement of disputes, none of which the West has ever committed itself to. Not.
look at the behavior of the OSCE in the months leading up to the special military operation in Ukraine. The OSCE, like so many other international institutions, was totally corrupted. So
Right.
the question is, will there be another? I don't want another one of the, okay?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. We don't,
Oh, but Peter, the OSCE, that's the last institute. No, you guys destroyed it.
that's right. That,
You
that, that,
gutted it.
that's right. That's exactly.
It's like the IAEA.
That's right. Exactly. The last thing we want is something that's exactly the same as this. But this is why I wanted to, take a look, which nobody ever does, as to what is in the Helsinki Final Act. In those days, these documents were relatively short. I mean, they weren't like these today when, like 500 pages that no one can possibly get through. So here this is the Helsinki Final Act, um, and and then it says the participating states will refrain in their mutual relations as well as in their international relations in general from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state or in any other manner inconsistent with the purpose of the UN and with the present declaration. No consideration may be invoked to serve to warrant the resort to the threat or use of force in contravention of this principle. Accordingly, the participating states will refrain from the acts constituting a threat of force or direct or indirect use of force against participating state. So right away you think, well, who first, started using
What about NATO?
exactly, exactly. You did that against Yugoslavia, one of the founders of the OSCE. They were there in 1975, and you did that. You did that repeatedly against Yugoslavia. Um, the threat, Yugoslavia posed no threat to anybody, no threat at all. So no threat to NATO, and NATO did that. But apparently, it's only Putin who is in violation of the Helsinki Final Act. Then, likewise, they will refrain from any manifestation of force for the purpose of inducing in other participation to renounce the full exercise of its sovereign rights, which is exactly what they did in Yugoslavia, said you were not allowed to, station your forces in Kosovo, which is part of your sovereign territory. And so then we got the inviolability of frontiers. The participating states regard as inviolable all one another's frontiers, as well as the frontiers of all states in Europe, and therefore they will refrain now and in the future from assaulting these frontiers.
Except for Kosovo.
Exactly, and of course, this was the point. This was it. 1991, when in violation of the Constitutional Court of Yugoslavia, Slovenia and Croatia declared their independence. So the Constitutional Court said these are unconstitutional acts, and it's the Europe, Germany, and then the EU, and then the United States followed, recognized these essentially illegal, unconstitutional acts. Oh yeah, that's fine. So you basically violated the frontiers of Yugoslavia.
Yeah. And then many years later, they'd be whining about Crimea. But anyway.
Exactly right. That's right. That's exactly. They always forget these things. It's always like history always
Oh,
just.
where was it? Stoltenberg, well, I don't know what do you say, NATO's involvement in the former Yugoslavia was a great success.
Was a great success, and that it was. He went even further. He said it had been sanctioned by the United Nations. NATO
No,
was
it had
acting.
been.
Now that's an interesting one, because he was lying, of course, because
Well,
Stoltenberg
no, and
was
then when
stupid.
Obama said, after the referendum in Kosovo,
That's
which
right.
there
After the
was no
referendum.
referendum.
They make this stuff up. They're always attacking Trump for making stuff up, and Trump does make stuff up. But these
Yeah,
people make stuff up all the time as well, and think that they're going to get away with it because people just
you,
don't know in any history, and they've all forgotten all this. They say, yeah, NATO is acting, with the sanction of the United Nations.
okay, comparing the empire of lies and then putting Trump right next to it. These are different categories.
Right,
I do believe that Trump lies. I think he makes things up. He certainly is the emperor of embellishment, but
right.
it's very different than what these people,
Yep.
Stoltenberg
Yes.
and Obama. No, because
Yes.
particularly with someone like Obama, he's reading a script.
Yes.
Okay.
That's right. And that's the point. These aren't accidents. When he says, oh, they had a referendum in Kosovo, that's not an accident. That was done deliberately. The people who write these speeches, they know this stuff. And you can always Google it. I mean, if you're not sure of it, you can Google it. So that when they put that in, they know exactly what they're doing and hope that they can get away with it. And by and large, they do get away
They
with it.
do.
Yeah, exactly. The journalists don't challenge them. They kind of challenge Trump, but they don't challenge Obama or Stoltenberg or Bill Clinton. And then we have the territorial integrity. The participating states will respect the territorial integrity of each of the participating states. Accordingly, they will refrain from any action inconsistent with the purpose and principles of the Charter of the UN against the territorial integrity, political independence, or the unity of any participating state. And then again, the participating states will likewise refrain from making each other's territory the object of military occupation or other direct or indirect measure of force in contravention of international law, or the object of any acquisition by means of such measures or the threat of them. And then,
Oh, George, I mean, come on, come on. Can you skip to the democracy part?
yeah, that's exactly. But you see, all of that, it's hard to see how
Yeah.
NATO expansion is in conformity with any of these declarations. This is the heart of it. This is the heart. This stuff.
Yeah.
This stuff comes right at the beginning of the Helsinki Final Act. The rest of it is a lot of stuff
There's
about
no
sporting exchanges, cultural exchanges, but this is at the heart of it.
there's no NATO exception here, everyone.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. And then peaceful settlement of disputes. That's a good one. The participating states will settle disputes among them by peaceful means in such a manner as not to endanger international peace, security, and justice. Just as we always go back to this Yugoslavia, because Yugoslavia is the fundamental crime of NATO. In what way were you peacefully settling that dispute? I mean, these were small countries. You could easily have come in and settled it peacefully. You didn't. They will endeavor in good faith and in a spirit of cooperation to reach a rapid and equitable solution on the basis of international law.
Oh, they were kind of rapid in use of force, if I
Very
remember.
rapid, exactly. And then negotiation, inquiry, mediation, conciliation, arbitration, judicial settlement, and other peaceful means of their choice, none of which did NATO use. And in the event of failure to reach a solution by any of the above peaceful means, the parties to a dispute will continue to seek mutually agreed ways to settle the dispute peacefully.
Oh yeah, they looked in at Serbia as a legitimate partner, right?
That
No,
legitimate part. They wanted to work out some kind of an equitable, amicable resolution. Well, you're right. Where is this democracy? I'm really looking forward to this. When are we going to get to the democracy bit? Non-intervention. You see, that's important. The non-intervention in internal affairs. There it is. Number six. There were 10 principles. Number six, non-intervention in internal affairs. So I know he's talking about this human rights, but it says non-intervention in internal affairs. The participating states will refrain from any intervention, direct or indirect, individual or collective, in the internal or external affairs falling within the domestic jurisdiction of another participating state.
yeah,
Regard
I remember living in Poland. It was an amazing thing, George, behind the Iron Curtain and all of these IBM Xerox machines were there.
That's right. Suddenly they
How did
appeared out
they
of
get
nowhere.
there?
That's right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Out of nowhere. And we covered all that. I mean, we talked about how, what they were doing, the CIA was doing in Poland, and the Pope, the Vatican, and the CIA together. No interference in internal affairs. They will act accordingly, they will accordingly refrain from any sort of armed intervention or threat of such intervention against another participating state. They will likewise, in all circumstances, refrain from any other act of military or of political or economic or other coercion designed to subordinate their own interest to their own interest, the exercise by another participating state of the rights inherent in its sovereignty.
Yeah, a lot of Russians wish that the West had honored the Helsinki
That's
Accords.
right. That's right.
You know why? Because then maybe Chechnya wouldn't have happened. A lot of people forget that
That's
now,
right.
but that
Lavrov
was
doesn't forget it. Lavrov didn't forget that. Yeah, so their involvement in Chechnya. And Putin, of course, always brings that up about Chechnya. Um, and then we have respect. This is where the respect for human rights and fundamental state. The participating states will respect human rights and fundamental freedoms, including the freedom of thought, conscience, religious, or belief, for all without distinction as to race, sex, language, or religion. They will promote and encourage the effective exercise of civil, political, and economic, social, and cultural rights. But you see, all of this is in their internal affairs, they will do this. It's an aspirational thing. But what's important is that you are not going to coerce anybody. That's the point. You're not going to interfere in other countries' internal affairs. Yeah, internally, yeah, we will have this aspiration, human rights, and the dignity of man and respect for the rights of minorities. Yeah, that's it. As you've signed all these documents, but it doesn't say, well, that means you can go and use human rights as somehow a cudgel
Yeah,
in order to
this is
interfere in the internal
this is
affairs of
this
other
is
countries.
this is number seven. So
Right.
it doesn't say here that if you do not pursue what is written here to our liking, then
Yes.
the first six are void and
That's
null.
right. Exactly. That's right. And then within this framework, the participating states will recognize the respect for the freedom of the individual to profess and practice alone or in community with others religion or belief in accordance with the dictates of his own conscience. But that's, you see, each state does that, commits itself to doing that. But nowhere does it say that you can use this in order to interfere in the internal affairs of your neighboring states. That's not what it says.
Well, but of course, a propagandist in the original article, it was the Guardian, correct?
Yep.
Okay. They would say just the opposite. They say, no, no, this gives us the right to not recognize and honor
You're
the
right.
first six
That's right. Yes.
points of this. No,
Right.
that they would say that with a straight face.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
You know why? Because they have, even in the countries that signed this, many of them still have had and still have a very neo-colonial view of the world.
Of course they did. And
No,
and this is
we are human. You can't touch us. We have pristine democracies and human rights records. Only these people commit atrocities.
that's right.
Only these people.
That's right. And as we said earlier, that's how they look upon this of the human rights. They say, oh, because hey, we in the West, we respect human rights. So even that, all right, they have a very particular narrow definition of human rights. It's very questionable whether they do respect those human rights, but let's say that they do. The Soviets and the communists did have a different conception of human rights. They did talk about social, economic, and cultural rights. The West may not like that. The West may not like, hey, we don't like the idea of a guaranteed job or a guaranteed healthcare or guaranteed, full employment and guaranteed pension. We may
Guaranteed
not like that because we don't have that in the West. But the communists did think in those terms.
a guaranteed place to live.
Exactly, guaranteed housing.
Oh no, no. Let's just cut it down to the core. Human rights. I'm right and you're wrong.
That's right. Exactly. Exactly. Um, and then there's the participating states on whose territory national minorities exist will respect the rights of persons belonging to such minorities. And then the participating state will recognize the universal significance of human rights and fundamental freedoms, respect for which is an essential factor for the peace, justice, and well-being necessary to ensure the development of friendly relations and cooperation. So this one paragraph, they seize on that and say, yeah, that's it. That's what this whole Helsinki Final Act is about. So everything else that we've gone through, well, apparently none of that
Yeah, but
matters.
George, sorry to piss on everyone's party here, but this is the the UN's the Charter of
Universal
Universal
Declaration
Rights.
of Human Rights. Yep.
That's what this
That's
is.
all
I
it
mean,
is. Exactly.
it's not news. It's
That's not
not news. It wasn't news in 1975.
That's right. It was signed. Everybody signed it and ratified the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 1948. Then there was the the International Covenant of Social, Economic, and Cultural Rights, which did specify about all the different rights that you have about full employment and so on, which not all countries. The United States signed it, but didn't never ratified it. I think they did finally ratify it with Jimmy Carter, but that all of that, but the West hasn't minimally adhered to that in the International Covenant of Social, Economic, and Cultural Rights. But yeah, but they want to, and no one cares. The Guardian doesn't talk about that. I mean, they say, well, they just ignore that, but they want to just pick on this and say, oh, this is really neat. We could use this against the communists. Isn't that clever?
Well, I
They
mean,
walked into a trap.
they trapped the Soviets in signing it. They'd already signed
They'd
these
already
conventions
signed it, exactly.
elsewhere.
It's already, you're absolutely right. They'd
And
already
what is
signed it and
new
ratified it in 1948.
and what was new and important for all parties is that these are borders. We're going to respect them. No one should interfere in the affairs of another country, and we have indivisibility of security.
Exactly.
That was a
That's
breakthrough.
that was the break, and here is the that and the Doric again, and he says here is in the field of human rights and fundamental freedoms, the participating states will act in conformity with the purposes and principles of the Charter of the United Nations, with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. They will also fulfill their obligation as set forth in the international declarations and agreements in this field, including inter alia the international covenants on human rights by which they may be bound. In other words, all of the documents that we've all already signed. And then here we have the from the same thing, the equal rights and self-determination of peoples, and and then and then we have the general. This is the part that the Russians really like. The general considerations, having considered the views expressed on various subjects related to the strengthening of security in Europe through joint efforts aimed at promoting détente and disarmament. So with détente, we never signed on to détente. It's like, so well, because of course this was part of détente. This was the whole. This really was the heyday of détente, 1975. Promoting détente and disarmament, the participating states, when engaged in such efforts, will, in this context, proceed in particular from the following essential considerations: the complementary nature of political and military aspects of security, the interrelation between the security of each participating state and security in Europe as a whole, and the relationship which exists in the broader context of world security between security in Europe and security in the Mediterranean area, and then respect for security interests of all states participating in the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, inherent in their sovereign equality.
Sovereign equality.
That's right.
Sovereign equality.
That's right. Um, so that's the point. Respect for security interests of all states. Oh no! NATO. No, it's our security. We're talking about our security. The only thing that matters is our security. Apparently nobody else has any right to security except us.
It's
That's
interesting.
fundamental violation of Helsinki.
NATO is not mentioned here, is it, George?
No, it's not. No, it is not. There's no mention.
No.
The importance of that participants in negotiating fora see to it that information about relevant development progress and results is provided on an appropriate basis to other states participating in the conference. So the point about looking through this is that the way that Helsinki is interpreted in the Western media is fundamental distortion. Say, oh yeah, human rights. Oh, that was great. We have this thing of human rights, which is just one paragraph among many, and doesn't say what you think it says, because it's just a reiteration of the previous declarations with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But fundamental doesn't say, hey, you can use this as a political weapon, because if you're using it as a political weapon, that violates the whole point of Helsinki Final Act.
What about Waco and Ruby Ridge?
Right.
Okay. What about those people's human rights? Okay.
That's right.
I mean, the reason why I bring it, I'm not trying to be obscure here. Okay. But you have Andrei Sakharov.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Okay. And he was turned into a god in the West. I can tell you, George, he is universally hated here. You know why? He was a traitor.
Yeah.
That's how he's looked upon. A traitor. Okay. And a very astute nuclear scientist that the perception was he was giving away state secrets. Okay. Oh no, he was a great Democrat. He was a great Democrat. Well, he wrote a lot of things. Okay. Well, and I'm not defending what happened to the people that were in Waco or at Ruby Ridge. Okay. But their human rights were violated.
Right.
Okay. Did anybody invoke the Helsinki Final Act? No. But when something happens in Eastern Europe it's the Helsinki Final Act. It's always that way.
It's always like that. And that's very interesting, because if Russia or the Soviet Union were ever to raise that issue, and they did raise these kinds of issues, oh, you're practicing whataboutism.
Whataboutism.
No, that's just whataboutism. They didn't take any of that seriously. No, whenever they brought anything like that up, oh, that's just whataboutism. So, in other words, you never took this seriously, even this one thing that you're obsessed with, this human rights. So, whenever they raised issues about Western violations of human rights statutes, oh, that we don't take any of that seriously. That's just they're just playing games. They're playing, this is typical Soviet or Russian gamesmanship. Nah, we don't take any of that seriously. But apparently they're supposed to take seriously. Well, when we point things out that's wrong with their countries, that they're supposed to take seriously. But anyway, so Lavrov wrote this article the other day about Helsinki, half a century of the Helsinki Act, expectations, reality, prospects. And here it
So
talk,
everybody, just keep in mind, this is what the foreign minister of Russia writes while Donald Trump is on Truth Social. Just, I think it's an interesting comparison.
but even Marco Rubio, who's supposedly an intellectual, I haven't seen the article by Rubio, a kind of a reflections on Helsinki or whatever. I mean, I don't really see it.
I don't know, George. I mean, I can't say. Does anybody really think that Marco Rubio is an intellectual?
I don't
I
think
guess
so.
I guess the bar is so
The
low now.
bar, yeah, that's right. Yeah,
Well, I guess smarter than most of them. That's
but
another
at
way.
least he had the reputation. I mean, yeah, well, he's a thinker. But of course, people always say that if you're really belligerent, if you're a foreign policy hawk, you are deemed to be an intellectual. I mean, if you're not a
Yeah,
foreign
yeah,
policy
yeah,
hawk,
yeah,
then
yeah.
then obviously you're just a
Well,
dimwit.
but it's interesting. I mean, you and I have never referred to Sergei Lavrov as an intellectual because we don't have to.
Right, right. Yep.
He-
Yeah, that's right. I mean, look, a foreign minister should be able to, put together an article. This isn't a scholarly article, but it's an article. A foreign minister should be able to do that. He has a staff. Every foreign minister, Marco Rubio has a staff that could put together an article for him. He doesn't do it. But I mean, you'd have, I'm trying to think of American hawks like the guy from Lieberman, Joe Lieberman. Oh, he's an intellectual. Who's a foreign policy intellectual. He's not an intellectual at all. He's just belligerent,
oh,
continually
what
belligerent.
was it was Senator Mitchell? He did the Good
George Mitchell.
Friday.
Yeah, the
Yeah.
good, yeah, the Good Friday.
He had some brain cells. Okay.
Right,
It's just that it just the nature of the American political system. It's almost like kryptonite to
right,
for intellectuals because
right, right, right.
you don't do a lot of thinking.
No, 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 no. I don't think so. But as we've
Daniel Patrick Moynihan.
oh yeah, yeah, he was Daniel Patrick.
Oh God, they worshipped
They
him, did
worship him, but Moynihan never wrote any of those books himself. He had a staff of people whom he didn't pay. They were all eager to work for him. He was a very prestigious. He was the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee. So students, from Harvard or whatever, that's very prestigious to get a job at the Senate Intelligence Committee. And they would write these books. And so he had the reputation. Oh, yet another book by Daniel Patrick Moynihan. He never said anything of any interest, and you never had to take him serious. I never took him very seriously. But when you have a lot of people that you can call on to write your books for you, it isn't hard to
Well, it's
write a
hard
book
to
every
write a
year with your name on the title page.
it's hard to write a book when you're inebriated most of the time. Anyway, let's keep going.
He was indeed inebriated a lot of the time. The Helsinki Final Act remains a landmark. It sets out the basic rules that should govern international relations, and it's a foundation for collective security. And it is clear no country can achieve lasting security by violating the sovereignty of others or undermining the rules-based order.
I don't know. I don't know. Was he grinning when he wrote that?
Yeah, that's right. But as we looked at it, that's pretty much in conformity with what the text says.
Yeah. To be fair, everyone, it's really sad when you have rules-based order. That's a nice little tight That's tight,
Hmm.
okay? And
Hmm.
it was so
Yeah,
abused that it became a signal for us to mock it. It
right,
shouldn't be.
right,
It shouldn't be.
right,
But the way it was abused, that's why George and I
right,
scoff at it every
right.
time we see it.
That's
Okay,
right. That's right.
I'm pretty sure the foreign minister meant it in
Yeah,
the way it was supposed to be.
that's it. Um, an analysis of those events from today's perspective leads to the conclusion that when the Helsinki process was launched, our country and the Westerners initially set different strategic goals. The USSR saw the main task as achieving security guarantees and conditions for peaceful development, and to this end, mutual recognition of the inviolability of European borders as they had been established following the Second World War. And then he quotes here Gromyko: the consolidation and inviolability of borders in Europe is the main result of my activities. If European countries abandon the Helsinki agreements and begin to violate them, war will come to Europe again.
Wow, prescient.
Prescient, exactly. These words of Andrei Gromyko turned out to be prophetic. The principle of inviolability of borders was trampled upon with the unilateral separation of Slovenia and Croatia from Yugoslavia in 1991 and the recognition of their independence first by Germany, which disdained the EU and NATO discipline, and then by the entire West. That's it. That's the key. What you did in 1991, you recognize this unilateral secession, not only a violation of Helsinki, it's a violation of of the UN Charter, violation of General Assembly resolution, which is you can't simply recognize unilateral secession, which is what that was in Yugoslavia. It was unilateral secession. You know that this was
Yeah.
illegal, unconstitutional. You went ahead and recognized it was a
Now,
fundamental violation of international law.
I've already mentioned, but cry me a river.
Right. Yeah.
Okay? Cry me a river, everybody.
Yeah.
Ramiko was right.
That's right. And then our Western neighbors invariably twisted other OSCE consensus principles to their advantage or did not observe them at all. They secretly worked to expose Soviet military and economic potential and to erode internal order in our country. Various methods were used, including the imposition of intrusive obligations on human rights issues. NATO and EU countries themselves considered respecting the Helsinki principles a burden, but at the same time, they forced others to selectively implement them, and to the extent that this met the interests of the West. For these purposes, the rule of consensus was also sacrificed. Because they right away they tried to use it in that unilateral way. As for the third basket, discussions on human rights protection in the OSCE have been used by the West from the very beginning for mentoring lectures, imposing neoliberal values, and attempts to create a loyal fifth column in the countries of the east of Vienna by organizing and financing a network of independent NGOs and media. That began the whole Soros movement, creating creating these NGOs, and the fifth column. You know, you now created a cadre, a growing cadre of people dependent on funding from Soros, and Soros was, of course, acting in tandem with Western governments. Soros wasn't just shelling out his own money. This was in tandem with Western governments. And you created a cadre of people wholly dependent. This was their source of income, coming from money coming from the West, and civil society programs. They weren't doing any civil society. There was no civil society here. This was done with a view to undermining the states in east of Vienna. Fundamental tasks: promoting intercultural dialogue, access to information, protecting the rights of national minorities. All this was watched out of the agenda. The widely advertised human rights instruments of the OSCE were in fact used, and as is now clear, intended for gross interference in the internal affairs of Russia and other participating states.
Yeah, so if Russia set up an NGO in, let's say, France, it was called a front. But
Exactly.
yeah,
Exactly.
when it's set up in Tajikistan, that's an NGO.
That's a very good point. Exactly. I mean, if you do it now, I mean, France simply outlaws
Yeah, everything.
Russian media. I mean, you're gone. You don't have any rights to have any sort of presence. How is that in conformity with Helsinki? Just simply outlawing RT or any Russian media outlets. Just that's it. We just you don't have it. You can't even get it on the internet. You can't get RT on the internet. It's the Russians who are violating Helsinki. The Western countries themselves, the Secretary General, and all OSCE institutions maintain a deathly silence looking at the actions of the Kiev regime, which since 2017 has adopted a series of laws exterminating the Russian language and culture. People are prohibited from studying, reading, and receiving information, and even simply communicating in their native language. The regime has also invaded such sensitive areas, religion, unleashing a campaign against the canonical Ukrainian Orthodox Church, and recently deprived its head of citizenship. Neo-Nazis have stooped to fighting against those who died in the battles of liberation of Ukraine from Hitlerism. The extreme level of cultural degradation, bordering on savagery, was demonstrated in Lvov, where the bodies of Soviet soldiers were exhumed on the Hill of Glory, and the mayor of the city proposed exchanging them for soldiers of the armed forces of Ukraine captured by our armed forces.
So the heroes that liberated us from Nazism, their bodies are now going to be used as a prop.
That's
Wow,
right. Yeah,
that's
that's
really stooping.
yes, yeah.
Stooping.
And um, and then for years, the OSCE executive structures have ignored discriminations against the Russian-speaking population of Moldova and the Baltics. They do this all the time. I mean, we've talked about it so many times before. Because the Baltics, they're members of the EU. And then, I mean, not just that they're in the OSCE, but they're members of the EU, and no one does anything about that. This that issue is never addressed. The cynical disregard by Riga and Tallinn for the problem of mass statelessness, numerous manifestations of Islamo and Christianophobia, including cases of public burning of the Koran in Denmark and Sweden, and persecution of the Eastern Orthodox Christian Church. They turn a blind eye to the long-term oppression of the descendants of the First Nations in Canada, where they continue to find unmarked mass graves of children among the indigenous people, to the violent dispersal of demonstrations in America and European cities, using special means of influence, or more simply police
Well,
battles.
remember the Canadian truckers, everybody.
That's right, exactly. And of course, remember the demonstrations against COVID. You remember they were setting dogs against peaceful demonstrators. Um, and So he's going through this list of saying, well, Helsinki, who exactly adhered even to this? I mean, in other words, leave aside all the issues of indivisibility or security. But if you want to talk about basket three, let's talk about basket three, which is your pride and joy. This is what you're so exultant about, that we had this, the basket three. Well, have you conformed in any way to the requirements of basket three? The information space in Ukraine, Moldova, and many EU countries is being subjected to a total purge. Repressive measures are being taken against Russian correspondents working there, including bans on participation in events, freezing of bank accounts, fines, harassment, intimidation by special services, non-renewal of accreditation, and inclusion of stop lists. We talked about those RT journalists who were arrested in Azerbaijan. I don't remember anyone in the OSCE raising that issue.
Or
Hey,
how about RT and Sputnik, the journalists going to, I don't remember what it was called, some kind of freedom of speech forum in Ukraine, and they were not allowed, they were journalists,
right.
but they weren't allowed to be part of a free speech conference.
That's right. Exactly. Yeah. Free speech? What are you talking about? Russians don't have any right to free speech. Free speech is not. It's not. What was it? The way that guy, the vice presidential candidate, who worked with Kamala Harris, that guy, governor of Tim
Oh
Walz.
yeah, that
Tim,
I just remember Jackass is
yeah,
his name.
jackass. But he said something like, "Oh, free speech is that's not a that's not an absolute right. There's not that's not
Look,
you don't have an absolute
everybody,
right for free speech."
I'm on the sixth floor of a building. Right in front of me is a playground with lots of children screaming at the top of their lungs. It's good that my microphone doesn't pick it up. And they have their parents and grandparents. Go down there, you're going to get just about every single opinion you could possibly
Right.
imagine on the thing.
Right.
Okay.
But
Totally.
when Tim Wolf says free speech is not an absolute right, we can't have RT and Sputnik around here. That's not guaranteed. Free speech is not guaranteed to them, even though in the United States, First Amendment absolutely guarantees that free speech for everyone. I mean, whether you're working for RT or Sputnik, your First Amendment covers them. In particular, in France, we have been faced with refusal to accredit since 2018, long before the SVO, representatives of T and Sputnik, under the pretext that they are not media but mouthpieces of Russian state propaganda. Uh,
CNN isn't.
yeah, exactly. That is such absolute rubbish. There's nothing there where we talk about in Helsinki Final Act, and particularly when they talk about in that basket three, there's nothing say, oh, well, only if you're working in the private sector do you get
Oh, right.
the rights. I mean, if you're in part of the government sector, no, you don't. We don't guarantee free speech rights to journalists who are working for state media. So that means what? The BBC? I mean, well, I don't think BBC should get no rights at all, or Deutsche Welle, or any of the other
Look at France
government-funded media.
24. Look at Al Jazeera.
Right. Government-funded media. Oh, well, so why is it only Russia that this applies to? And this is despite the fact that it was on France's initiative that the 1990 Charter of Paris for a New Europe enshrined the solemn promise by all OSCE participants to ensure free access to any information, both on their territory and to that which originates from any territory of other OSCE participating states. So if you're going to talk about well, the signing documents and not adhering to them, yeah, what happened to that? What happened to that 1990 Charter of Paris? I mean, clearly the Western countries had no intention of adhering to this, but except to just use it as political a weapon. Um, and it turns out that this promise was also a lie and is no longer valid, as it too has fallen victim to the cancel culture, the same one under which they are trying to cancel everything Russian in Europe. A recent example is the last minute cancellation of a concert by soloists of the Mariinsky Theatre under the direction of Valery Gergiev in Italy. At the same time, in the OSCE, from the Secretary General to the Representative on Freedom of the Media and the High Commission of National Minorities, everyone kept mum. They always keep mum. And again, in the Helsinki, we didn't go through that whole thing about all the sporting and cultural exchanges. Well, what happened to that? I mean, they constantly prevent not just cultural but sporting exchanges, even sportsmen. It's a real struggle. What was it in the last Olympics, the one held in Paris? They were boasting about how few Russian athletes were
Yeah.
able to take part. Oh, isn't it fantastic?
Yeah.
Normally they have a big team, but we really reduced it down to about 10 athletes.
And juxtapose that to George and I remember this very well. I remember how the press played with it, and I really liked it. The ping pong diplomacy
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
with communist China. That was a big deal. It made it into Forrest Gump. Even.
Exactly. It made it in the Forest Gump. But there's also the case that, in the 1972 Olympics in Munich, where the Soviets outshone everybody, they won the most medals, most gold medals, and their athletes became, heroes in Germany, including Olga Korbut, and which actually put women's gymnastics on the map. No one had ever paid attention to that, but there was Olga Korbut, who was a star and was applauded wildly by the Germans. This was in front of the German audience. So these were Germans. This is 72. So many of the members of the German audience had fought in the war, certainly had a living memory of the war, and nonetheless, they were all excited by Olga Korbut.
Yeah.
Boy, has that changed. um, so the OSCE Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights has been turned into an openly biased instrument of political pressure. The content of this ODIHR election observation mission reports is dictated exclusively by geopolitical considerations. If a non-Western candidate wins, the harshest assessments are given, up to and including demands to cancel the election results. Yeah. And to this practice, with the pre-prepared conclusions on elections, is described in Brussels as the gold standard of electoral observations. Fraud. It was a fraud. It was a fraudulent election. And then when you get the right
Yeah, but
man,
George, it's called a fraud before the
that's
election.
right. Exactly. That's right. You have to cancel the election. Hey, looks like we're going to get the wrong result, as they did in Romania. And then when you finally get the right result, when you basically banned all the candidates from running who might win, this is a triumph for democracy. Out comes Michael McFaul,
It's the gold
the
standard.
gold standard. That's it. Congratulations to the people of Romania. You know that they voted for the right person. Um, the special monitoring missions of the OSCE deserve special mention. Let's recall what an unsightly role one of those missions played in Kosovo's Ratchak in 1999. So people remember that was really the moment that they got the casus belli to launch the bombing, because then they could say, oh, look, you know, innocent civilians had been massacred by the horrible Serbs, whereas, of course, the whole thing had been set up by the OSCE mission led by William Walker. The people who were killed were KLA fighters. They were killed in a firefight. But the way it was presented to the world was that somehow the Serbs went in and massacred innocent civilians. And by strange coincidence, they were all men. They're all men of fighting age. Isn't that amazing? Men of fighting age, but they were all simply innocent bystanders who were killed. But that's why it was important that Lavrov brought that up. A group of inspectors arrived at the site of the discovery of corpses of Kosovars, and the head of the mission, a U.S. citizen, immediately, without an investigation, announced an alleged act of genocide. He called it a crime against humanity, not genocide, but nevertheless, that's what he said. He said, without any investigation, William Walker said, oh, I know a crime against humanity when I see it. And it was not within his authority to draw such a conclusion. It was subsequently reliably established that those killed in Ratchak were militants of the KLA, especially dressed in civilian clothes. However, the staged act orchestrated by the OSCE mission was used as a pretext for the illegal use of force and the destruction of Yugoslavia. Um, and so, and then the impartiality of the monitoring of the situation in Ukraine by the OSCE mission, which operated from 2014 to 2022, was not ensured. The inspectors ignored violations of human rights and media freedom in the territory controlled by Kiev, paid no attention to the rampant aggressive nationalism and facts of discrimination against the Russian-speaking population, and deliberate murder of civilians in Donbass. In fact, the mission covered up the crimes of the Kiev regime and the termination of its activities, cases of OSCE observers participating in adjusting fire on their positions in Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, and their involvement in collecting intelligence in the interests of the armed forces of Ukraine. So that's
If
the
there
OSCE.
was an honest assessment of the Helsinki process 50 years on, this is what you should talk about.
Right.
But it's
That's right.
not.
No, exactly. Exactly. None of that. So, you know, just that article by the Guardian, that's typical. None of that is ever mentioned. You know, you just say, oh, fantastic, the OSCE, these OSCE missions.
Well, it's also kind of interesting is that the OSCE is in the way it's presented in the West, it is it is like frozen in time in 1975. And
Right.
what the Russian foreign minister is doing here is no, these are obligations that are not bookend.
Right.
Okay, they're open, and so they separated. It's just
Right.
like a separation. This
Yes.
was a it's in 1975 dot, and then we move
Right.
on. No, this was the
Right.
mechanism,
Right.
and it's not presented that way.
Yes. Yes. That's right. And that's the point that the OSCE was misused in this one-sided political way, and that's why Lavrov says, well, this really wasn't what we were supposed to accomplish. I mean, and part of what happened after the Helsinki Final Act was this negotiations, those mutual balanced force reductions, and the cafe talks, all of which were violated by the West. Those were totally violated. So basically, because the West just had, with the NATO expansion, had moved its forces to the West, but still wanted to make
Yeah,
sure that the Russians could continue to
but
disarm.
see, but see, George and I in this podcast have a number of themes, and one of them is so obvious, is NATO is the poison
Yes,
of European security.
yes,
That it's the poison,
yeah,
and you can have the if you look at the Helsinki Act, which we've gone over pretty well here, due to the good work of George here. But that is the gorilla in the corner
right,
that will never allow a Helsinki process
right,
to ever to be really meaningfully
right,
enacted. Okay,
right.
because NATO is a cancer.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. It was a cancer because what he did was with its expansion and fundamentally shifting the balance of power in Europe to the detriment of Russia. It guaranteed war. I mean, the very thing that he was supposed to prevent, it guaranteed it. It guaranteed that there would be war, that Russia would not indefinitely put up with this NATO encroachments pretty much on its territory. And NATO thinks that it has a basic, we have a fundamental, we have a right to do this. This is absolutely right. That we should surround Russia with NATO forces. And that is the fundamentally violation of Helsinki and guarantees war. I mean, countries are not going to tolerate this indefinitely. And then here, among the failed attempts to resolve the acute problems of our continent on the principles of the OSCE, we recall the DN Kozak memorandum, which could have reliably settled the situation in Moldova back in 2003. Now, most people don't really know this. What's the Kozak memorandum? Well, what happened in 2003? But it is very true that they came very close to an agreement on the issue of Moldova and Transnistria. I mean, really close to an agreement. They were on the brink of signing, but the West applied pressure on Moldova, and at the last minute, the president of Moldova, I can't remember his name now, he withdrew his signature, and that could have dealt with the whole issue of Moldova and Transnistria, creating a federation in Moldova. But the West didn't really want this. And that's right. The West intervened to guarantee this continued 20 years on, more than 20 years on, this continuing conflict in Moldova with Transnistria. Lavrov brings this up because everyone's just forgotten all this. What's the Kozak memorandum? Yeah, they were on the brink of settling the Moldova
This is
crisis.
another example. I bring this up every once in a while because it's so important. Lavrov is right, George is right in mentioning this because, again, we're always conditioned to remember events that are important to the
Yes,
West.
that's right. That's
Okay. And if it's not important to the West, it's not important at all.
no, that's right. Exactly. That's exactly. So so it's buried in history, and you say, well, what happened there? No, it's the West intervened on the very brink of a signing of an agreement because they didn't want it. They did not want it. So, oh no, that's giving the Russians too much. Oh no, no, we can't have an agreement. So it's better to have this crisis fester. And remember, they're always saying that these what are they, the frozen disputes, the frozen conflicts, they're always Russia's fault. They always say, always Russia that wants these frozen disputes to continue. No, 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 it's the West that always, you
Because
know,
you can turn up the heat, you can
yeah,
turn down the heat.
that's right. And this was it. That's right. NATO and EU, Brussels unceremoniously torpedoed this initiative, already agreed upon by Chisinau and Tiraspol, and now they're killing the 5+2 format and the last thing that remains of the inclusive mechanism of the Transnistrian settlement. Um, I think we're going to talk in the next couple of days about Moldova because Moldova is also heating up because there's an election coming up next month. There's always an election in Moldova, and already the whole NATO EU apparat has gone into overdrive about Russian interference.
No, and it's really interesting is you have the current political elite in power in Moldova. I saved it because I knew we were going to talk about. I don't have it in front of me, but uh, France's interference in our democracy. It's a good thing. We welcome
That's
outside interference.
that's right.
I mean, I can give quote. I will give
Right.
quotes.
Right.
Okay,
That's right. That's right. Yeah. Thank you, France.
thank you, France.
Um, and then the OSCE has no future if NATO and EU countries finally break the rule of consensus and continue to use the Vienna platform as their own property for a sweeping propaganda campaign to demonize Russia and other disobedient countries and to protect their proteges.
Well, everybody, again, bring it right home. The Vienna platform. Well, I was at one of those meetings, okay? And I was there as a representative of the Russian Federation. And man, did I have a good time. From the very beginning, when you go in, you have your passport, you get your little badge and everything. So I give my passport and they shuffle through the files. Oh, Mr. Lavelle, we can't find you here. I said, well, what list are you looking at? We're looking at the United States. I said, no, I'm representing Russia. Yeah. And they're, oh, and they open up another. Oh, I see you're here. Okay. That was the beginning of the fun. Okay.
Right.
So I'm walking around with Russian Federation. Everybody knows who I am too. And because when I walked, I felt like I was separating the Nile. I mean, just like some kind of gravitational force, people moved out of my way when I was walking. That's the bias. That is the intense bias of that operation.
Right.
Okay, and all it was the plenary sessions over there. It was during the Skripal affair.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
But this is the thing. I mean, so going back to what you were saying is that well, we don't want a revival of OSCE. So the Guardian says, oh yeah, we should go back to the OSCE model. What they mean is that like the sort of post 1990 OSCE model, but Russia isn't going to go with that because we've seen how OSCE operates. They basically, this is the West manipulates this in order to continually demonize Russia. That's the point. That's that model, and the notion that Russia is just going to indefinitely sit and allow itself to be demonized. So that we're trying to get however many members there are now. I don't know, it's in the 50s, 57 or whatever, to use that in order to somehow build up this consensus against Russia. Well, that's not that that's in obvious violation of Helsinki, but it's also not a viable solution to security problems. You can't do
Oh,
that.
no,
You
no,
can't just
yeah,
simply turn all these
exactly.
countries against Russia and imagine Russia's just going to tolerate that.
No, it's the ignoring and abusing the entire Helsinki process that was institutionalized through the OSCE, the the lack of goodwill, the
Right,
very bad will on part of the West,
right,
particularly the United States, the UK, brought the war to Ukraine.
right. Exactly.
That's Scott Horton, great guy, provoked. Everybody should read it, okay? But if you want a different trajectory, is the hope of Helsinki is to recognize the geopolitical realities of the Second World War. That was a confidence building, huge one.
Right.
Okay. We're not going to fight each other over these things. We agree we're not going to do that.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
But
Yeah.
because there was no, the Helsinki process was never fulfilled, the West never fulfilled it, brought war to Ukraine.
That's right, and that's why it's very important, to look at it in a different way, which was that if you recognize the Soviet Union's security concerns, if you accept that they have very legitimate fears of invasion from the West, then if you do that, if you no longer pose a threat to them, then you can liberalize within. So nothing to do. Oh, basket three. Basket wasn't because of basket three, but because they were not feeling under such threat as before. There's always a correlation between if you make the Cold War, anti-Sovietism, anti-communism intense, then there is a crackdown at home. It's always, I mean, you don't have to be a political scientist to figure out the cause and effect.
Look at the Patriot Act,
Yeah,
everybody.
exactly. That's it. The moment they felt threatened, that's it. In the Cold War, late 1940s, suddenly there are campaigns going on against the Trotskyists and the Zionists and the
And then
imperialists.
the juxtaposition is the Red Scare.
Exactly. If the juxtaposition is exactly right. There's always a symmetry. But if you remove that, well, lo and behold, suddenly you're able to sign agreements, and therefore there'll be more of this interhuman connections, as you saw in Germany. Well, look at that. Now they're all these people are able to visit. People from the East are able to visit their relatives in the West. People in the West are able to visit their relatives in the East. Suddenly you're able to do that, which you weren't able to do just a few years earlier. And the same thing happens. Suddenly, hey, people are able to visit, people, from Hungary or, other countries. They're able to even travel with their families to the West. You couldn't do that at the height of the Cold War. So that it's nothing to do with basket three, but you have to somehow guarantee security that you have no aggressive intent, and then things liberalize. But when you do this, when you have you continually show that you have aggressive intent, malevolent intent, then you're going to get all sorts of bad things, because that's what people do when they feel threatened. They crack down. As I said, that exactly the same thing happens in the West. Same thing happened in the East.
It's a real pity that the spirit of Helsinki never came into fruition from the get-go, everybody, from the get-go. It was never taken
Yeah,
seriously by the West at all, okay? It just, oh, we got him, basket three,
yeah,
okay?
right,
You and I grew up with that.
right. Yeah, I remember. Yeah,
When the Helsinki process was brought, it was the only discussion was basket three. That's
that's
the
right.
only thing everyone
Exactly.
talked about.
That's right. Exactly. Yeah, that's right. That's what it was. Human rights. Um, and I remember when Jimmy Carter started off, he started off with, oh, there's the human rights. And of course, the Russians are really angry about this, because it's like, hey, we want to have a meeting with the American president because there's an awful lot of issues to discuss. And you're talking about, various dissidents. We want to discuss arms control, the next arms control agreement, the Middle East, and we're not discussing any of that. We're talking about dissidents. And I think Carter did realize that, if he's going to go down this path of just simply raising this guy and that guy and so on, then he's not going to get anywhere. And I think that he kind of
Yeah,
put the whole human rights thing on the back burner,
yeah,
and
but
then
he
have to
did.
focus on other things.
The U.S. under Jimmy Carter, they walked away from the Olympics, right?
That's right. It was Jimmy. Yeah, that's right. They left them
Yeah,
out.
that's not the spirit of Helsinki.
That's not the spirit of Helsinki. Well, what Jimmy Carter did, of course, he really annoyed the U.S. athletes. I mean, that wasn't even a good move from America's perspective, because these are people who've been training all their lives for this.
Oh my.
They're one shot at
And
an
that was that
Olympic
back then it
medal.
was every 4 years, everyone.
Yeah.
You're training,
Yeah.
maybe you're at your peak powers
Yeah.
when you're at 18, 19, 20. Your
Right.
peak powers,
Right.
okay?
Right.
4 years later, you
No,
There's
no.
going to be those guys behind you. They're going to be at
Exactly.
their
It's
peak
it's it's
powers.
it's you have a very small window as an athlete, so when you're at the pass. So when he did that, um, I mean, obviously the Russians were very unhappy about this. They put a lot of effort
Yeah,
into
well, then
the Moscow Olympics.
they twisted the knife and said, "Well, we're not coming to yours."
That's exactly what they.
And we've learned nothing, have
Right,
we?
right,
We've learned nothing.
right. That's right.
Okay.
That's right. Yeah. And I remember when they did that and the Los Angeles and the America. This was in the kind of heyday of Reaganism, and they said, okay, well, we don't need them. We don't need the Soviets. We don't need all because the Eastern Europeans they didn't show up. We don't need them. But yeah, and America, of course, romped home with all the gold medals. You absolutely need them because it renders the whole thing meaningless. I mean, if the best athletes in the world are not taking part in these games, then it doesn't matter that America wins all the gold medals. I mean, it's a meaningless event. But so
Never know if you really are the best.
no, of course not. But somehow in this kind of, I remember that 84 in this sort of delusional atmosphere. So, well, we don't need them. Who needs all these Russians and Poles and
Well, yeah,
Hungarians?
well, they're all spies
They're all
anyway.
spies. They're all communists. They're all, they're all just ideologues. They're all working for the government anyway. So that's right. But it was a totally meaningless event. This the Los Angeles Olympics. But just going back to the point, you're absolutely right. The West had never had any serious intention of adhering to the Helsinki Final Act. So there's the most important kind of kind of event or diplomatic event of the post-war era, and the West never had any intention of
Well,
following
this
through.
goes back to one of our most important talking points since the conflict in Ukraine accelerated in 2022. It all started, at least this iteration was in 2014, which people want to separate them. They're not
Right,
separate, okay? Um, and there was a vehicle there to negotiate this. It was the OSCE, but by then it had become so corrupt.
right,
There was nothing left.
right,
Remember, everyone, December 15th, 2021, the Russians didn't work through the OSCE to
right,
communicate with the West. They had to do it directly to NATO
right,
and to the United States.
right.
Okay?
Yes,
They had shown that the OSCE had become useless, tainted, corrupt, and almost every single OPCW, all of these institutions that should be really important to all of us, they're a bit trashed. They're just trashing all of them,
yeah,
going backwards,
yep,
going backwards. It's in a, and one of the key element of all this is no negotiation, no diplomacy.
right. Yes, yes,
And
yeah,
what do you expect to happen then?
yes, yes, yeah, yeah.
Get Steve Witkoff's contacts. We've got to send this video to him. Okay. Trump won't watch it because it doesn't have pretty girls.
No,
Okay.
no, that's a problem. We really should do that. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, you're right.
You got a long flight, Steve. Okay. You can put it on your iPad.
That's
Okay.
right. That's right. And one has to exactly. Steve Witkoff or whoever needs to see it is say, that's there is a perspective of the other side that you just simply never take into
You think?
consideration.
Yeah.
And that's what's important. There is a reason why the Russians repeatedly go back to Helsinki, and they say, that was a moment when things could have gone in a different direction. And you basically, when you don't recognize our security needs, then there's always going to be trouble. And if you think that you can get any sort of a deal without taking into consideration our security needs, then you're just wasting time. You're wasting everybody's time. And that's pretty much what the West has been doing now for years and years and years, which is, you're wasting time.
So Donald Trump, you say you have all these nice conversations with Vladimir Putin. I believe they are nice.
Mhm.
But you don't have this history in front
Right,
of you. You're not aware of this.
right,
maybe we can cut a deal, and the Russians will be saying, "Yeah, we've done this with you over and over and over again."
Right.
All right, and now we have a war on our border.
Yeah.
Okay, young men are dying.
Yep.
So, I mean, you got to say something new.
Yes.
And George and I have said from donkey years now, the OSCE, scrap it. It's dead. It's done. Now, I try to be magnanimous. Okay, we need a new OSCE. Okay, and I don't know if that's even possible because I don't think we don't see any goodwill ever.
No.
It's just going to be a cudgel. How do we continue? Instead of working towards peace and stability. Okay, don't look for a way to undermine it from the beginning.
Right.
And that's why I've always said you got to go big to go
Right.
small.
Right. Right.
And because of the last 50 years anniversary, that's hardly likely. And that's the pity of our time.
No question. And what you don't want is precisely what like that Guardian article, which is, oh, let's find a cudgel in order to bash them. Something. Oh, that's really clever. Hey, the Russians walked into a trap. They didn't walk into any kind of a trap. But the whole idea that you're going to just any agreement that you sign, you immediately are thinking about how do I violate this? How do I make this in such a way that we wrong foot the Russians? That's not going to get anywhere. And if any attempt to do that now and somehow we're going to put the Russians on the back foot. That's not going to work. And that's all they've been doing with the OSCE. They've been using it as a propaganda tool, as something they can use against Russia. It's just and that's obviously complete
Yeah, well, see, George,
this process.
this is George is right. You never get a different point of view. For the Russian side, these agreements really mean something to
Right,
them, okay? And so when there's a problem, there are tensions, let's go back to principles,
right,
okay? How we agreed how to move forward.
right,
How often have you heard the OSCE mentioned in Western media during the entire time of this conflict in Ukraine? Never once.
right,
But that is a default position among the Russians,
right,
okay?
right,
How to avoid conflict. And
right.
what we've seen from the West is going back to Scott Horton's great title, provoked. All you do is provoke.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That
So
that that's what that's what.
it's it's really maybe pedantic for someone that accidentally comes across this video. It might happen. They'll say Peter and George are talking about such obscure things, but they're not obscure at all.
Right,
It's really the
right,
tapestry that you really need to look at to understand what's happening now.
right. Exactly. Exactly. It's provoked, and I think as Lavrov goes through that list, he says, well, and what he did there, he says, okay, let's just focus on basket three. This is the one thing that you seem to
This is your
care
hobby
about.
horse. This is your hobby horse. Yeah.
Exactly. You don't not none of everything else in the final act you ignore. You don't even make any pretense of taking any interest in. This is the basket three. Well, look at it. Look at this basket three. You haven't even done the minimum to satisfy the conditions of basket three. All you do is use this against us. And you think, and that's all you have to do. You just they're violating human rights, and the Russians they don't have any human rights. The Russians in the Baltic states they don't have
Well,
any
no,
human
they're
rights.
treated as not human, and if you're not human, you don't have rights. I'm sorry.
No, I think it's right. That's exactly right. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Remember, everyone, interesting fact at a cocktail party. Russia is the only large landmass that the West never colonized in 500 years. Okay? And people have tried. And they've left with their tail between their legs, okay? This it's even Lavrov doesn't really even express how visceral this is to the Russian mind, okay? Of being dominated. No. And they see how Western powers have dominated the rest of the world, and they refuse to submit. Look what's happening right now with the trade deal between the United States and Europe. It's not written down, so who knows really what's in it, okay? But this is the West cannibalizing itself. This is the West, the United States doing to Europe now what the Europeans did for 500 years to the rest of the world. It's about submission. It's subjugation. And this is one way of looking at it. George and I have nuanced conversations about this elsewhere. But I mean, this is the ethos of domination. And the Russians are resistant to it. And what do? They resort to, well, the West comes up with this idea of international law and rules and all, and we'll go along with it. Maybe it'll help us out. And even when they go along with it, it doesn't work.
No, no. I think as we've said many times before, the West has no interest in international law, and that's why I think it's a waste of time even talking about international law. They invoke international law when they think that they can use it as a cudgel against someone else, but then when you bring it up against the West, and they say, "Huh," as George W. Bush said, "Go find me some international lawyers." They don't care about it. So there's no point in even getting involved in these arguments about international law. They don't care about it. Just as the rules-based order, they have no interest at all other than to use it as a propaganda tool. And so, it's a waste of time. With the West only understands power. And one has to admit, in 1975, the Soviet Union conveyed power,
Add the
conveyed
power.
strength. And when you convey power and you convey strength, then the West sits up and listens and makes due concessions for the time
Said
being.
differently, if you want to have a normal conversation with me, respectful,
Right.
you have to recognize the sacrifice of the Red Army and the people of the Soviet Union during from 1941 to 1948. That's the starting point to have a real conversation here. You are resistant to doing that, but that's our ground zero to have civil, respectful relations with you. And you know what? The West agreed.
The West agreed. But look, I mean, you have to think, if you go back to that time, the 1970s, there was a genuine fear and respect of the
I
Soviet
remember
Union.
it. You remember it.
Absolutely, absolutely. When Brezhnev came to Washington, this is a powerful figure. This is someone you respect. You didn't jerk Brezhnev around.
No, no,
Yeah,
Zelensky, Oval Office.
right, exactly. So that was the important, that this is what they had accomplished, and the West, they understand and appreciate power. When they're up against a formidable adversary, then they stop in their tracks and they make due accommodations. They're not serious about it. And we know, as we've discussed today, I mean, they were never serious about it, but at the very least, they had to sit down and agree to things that instinctively they never really wanted to
Right.
agree to. So, which is why they immediately started twisting it and distorting it to mean something other than that. But they had to agree to it because, hey, we're really up against somebody who is
Yeah,
strong and getting
but the
stronger.
but the origins of that is that they feel that they are morally superior.
Right.
We can never get away from that. Okay? Joseph Burrell, God, I miss that guy because he was good material, okay? But he let the mask drop, We're the garden and they're the jungle.
Yeah.
He said that what in 2023, 24?
Something like that. Yeah. Can't remember. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, anyway, I don't want to go on
Yeah.
another tantrum here. It's
Yeah.
my first day of vacation. Thank you, George, for being on my program earlier this morning. Thanks for doing this. Okay. I'm on vacation, but I'll make time for our podcast here.
Yeah.
Don't worry about it. All right, everybody, this is The Gaggle with Peter and George. We're on local, so please go to thegaggle.locals.com. Even though I'm on vacation, we will do a live stream, God willing,
Exactly.
tomorrow.
God willing, tomorrow, 10 a.m. Eastern Time, we'll do a joint live stream. Then on Tuesday, 3 p.m. Eastern Time, I'm doing my solo. So but in the meantime, you got to think about the dogs because the dogs say, yeah, yeah, we really strongly believe in this kind of mutual back scratching. And so everybody recognizes everybody's security concerns and everybody's food concerns, and particularly the tip jar concerns. So, the buddy said, yeah, yeah, I got it. That's part of the
What
Helsinki
about
Final Act.
Chihuahua self-determination?
It's self-jar, self-determination, and above all, everybody puts whatever they've got into the tip jar. That was part of the Helsinki Final Act. So if you have anything in your bank account, under the sofa, anywhere, whatever it is, just pick it up and just put it straight into the tip jar. The dogs, no messing around. We're very grateful for all of your help, friendship, and support. The more you're able to donate, the more of these videos we can make, the more we can improve on the technology. And we're going to keep the dogs, happy for, just a little while longer. It's very, very hard. So remember, if you like the gaggle, please like, share, and subscribe. See you soon. Bye-bye.